I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. Later, we'll hear from Times Metro reporter Corey Kligannon on crime. But first, in recent weeks, the New York Times has been running a series on the challenges to democracy. Motivated by 2020 election deniers and also by the wealth of disinformation that's out in the world, the Times has been looking at these threats both here in the U.S. as well as around the world. One of the key findings is that there are hundreds of candidates in the upcoming midterm elections who've doubted or outright denied the results of the 2020 election that Joe Biden won. The Times with Siena College has also taken polls on these topics. Nick Corisaniti is a national reporter for the New York Times. He's been writing about these threats and analyzing the poll results. He joins us now. Welcome, Nick, and thank you for joining us. Right after the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, Ben Franklin was asked, what kind of government do we have, a republic or a monarchy? And he said, a republic if you can keep it. Well, you know, it seems like now we may be having a hard time doing just that. You reported in that Times Siena College poll that voters are worried about democracy. They think democracy is in peril, but they don't think saving it is much of a priority. Why is that? And if they're so worried, then why are they bothering to vote at all?
Well, that kind of gets at the crux, I think, of the poll and everything we've kind of struggled to understand within the electorate about current threats to democracy. In our poll, we found 71% of voters, an overwhelming amount, said that democracy is at risk, but only 7% said it was their top issue. And what ranked highest for almost every voter, Republican, Democrat, Independent, were issues about the economy, inflation, economic woes. It gets down to the simplicity of gas prices and the immediacy of those issues. The everyday waking up about how do you afford X or what am I going to do in terms of my job security. Those tend to weigh on voters' minds more so this year than any other issue. Especially as we kind of get into the closing weeks here of the midterm elections. And so I think while voters acknowledge that there is, a significant risk to American democracy, especially after the 2020 election, it's just there's more pressing issues for their immediate day-to-day life. Whereas something like how does our democracy survive feels foreign and esoteric and hard to really grasp on a day-to-day level. So we saw those economic issues really rise even beyond access to abortion. And I think that's kind of what we see is really motivating voters as we head into these final 3 weeks.
Nick, it's certainly understandable on one practical level why people are concerned about inflation, gas prices, housing prices, crime, and other relevant issues like that. But are they losing faith in the ability of democracy to solve those issues?
Well, we actually saw kind of conflicting opinions here. It was pretty surprising to see 71% of the country say democracy was at risk, but 82% thought that these issues could be fixed within our own system. So using Congress, state legislatures, the court system, and the executive office, that we could address these threats to democracy. When we spoke to voters again, when we called some of them back to have more in-depth conversations, they pointed to past struggles that our democracy has overcome, the suffrage movement, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. And they thought that because we were able to address those issues within our system and, have wins for civil rights and voting rights, that could be done again. But at the same time, there is a pretty persistent erosion of faith in our electoral process that's bled beyond just the Republican Party. It was a little over a quarter of all voters said that the 2022 they don't have a lot of faith that the 2022 midterms will be tallied and conducted accurately, and that was 41% Republicans felt that. Now this is before we've seen a single result. We're still 3 weeks out from Election Day, so to see that lack of faith in the 2022 midterm results among both Republicans and independents shows how much corrosion has happened within the electorate in terms of their faith in our voting process. But then you look at how voters feel about how we can go about fixing this in the future, and there seems to be pretty widely held beliefs that this is fixable.
Nick, one thing that seemed dichotomous to me, I looked at a Quinnipiac poll that came out this week after Donald Trump endorsed Lee Zeldin in the gubernatorial race in New York. And he has hinged his campaign pretty much on an urgent issue facing the state as he sees it, crime and inflation. But the most urgent issue following that, according to his campaign, is protecting democracy. So how does he square those things?
Well, what I think you see is a rallying cry among the Republican base is this issue of quote unquote election integrity. And that's been a long, focus of different Republican politicians for decades. There was the 2006, there was the voter ID push. There's been different efforts at different restrictions to voting going back to immediately after the Voting Rights Act was passed. So I think among the Republican base, you still see that, calls for securing our elections as a sign that, there's still a lot of distrust among the Republican base about our electoral process, especially after former President Trump continues to say the 2020 election was rigged. Falsely, obviously, Joe Biden clearly won. But that persistence, I think, has become bedrock within the Republican Party right now.
And so protecting democracy is a matter of definition.
Exactly. And when we asked voters, what do you consider threats to democracy? And it changed significantly based on the partisan lens. Republican voters said it was Joe Biden, said it was the mainstream media, said it was voting by mail. Whereas Democrats took, the tack of it's former President Trump, it's election deniers, and it's the Electoral College. So even how I think voters are viewing what is the threat to democracy still boils down to politics.
3 in 10, nearly 3 in 10 of the people polled in the Times poll have little faith in the accuracy of the midterm elections, much less 2 years from now in the presidential election. What's that going to mean if they don't think those results either are going to count or are the result of some sort of fraud?
Well, I think we're starting to see a little bit of how that might play out. And, we looked at I just did another story with my colleague, Alexandra Berzon, and we looked at how poll watchers, which are a standard part of American elections, they're partisan volunteers who go and observe the election process, preferably having one from both sides so that everyone can have faith and certify that these elections are on the up and up. And what we saw from the Republican side was pretty aggressive behaviors, isolated but still consistent, that hinted at these grand doubts about the voting process and the electoral process. They were questioning simple routine procedures and assuming that there was something nefarious with them. They were, harassing voters and harassing poll workers, saying, assuming the worst when it was actually just, standard operating procedure. Trying to track voting machines. One partisan poll watcher in Texas got in her car and followed another election official down the road when they were transporting the voting machines after primary day in March and tried to get into the secure area, all under this assumption that something nefarious is going on with our election process, kind of stemming out of, again, the falsehoods and lies told about the 2020 election.
Go ahead.
There is just like this, kind of bedrock among a lot of the Republican base that I think no matter what the election outcome is, there's going to be a certain percentage and a greater percentage than we've seen in history that's just simply going to distrust any loss.
One of the things you pointed out in Times articles that really has probably been overlooked, and lots of money pouring into these races too, is state legislative races that are probably going to be more important than ever. Why is that?
So state legislatures, as you and I have covered throughout the years, are always important in terms of funding and schools and state budgets, taxes, things like that. So they have an immediate impact. But there's been a number of Supreme Court decisions in the past few years that have really elevated the control that state legislatures have over the issues, kind of dominating Americans' daily lives, from gun laws, access to abortion, voting laws. These are like the national politics, national policy issues being argued, on national TV and everything. But the way they get meted out is not through a deadlock Congress. It's not through a 50-50 Senate. It's through these state legislatures. And so that has taken on, new importance in state legislative races. And then there's the issue of the independent state legislature theory, which is a case that's being heard before the Supreme Court right now, stemming out of a redistricting argument in North Carolina. But it has the potential outcome of giving state legislatures the basically unchecked authority over federal elections. It would remove state courts from having any oversight based on a conservative reading of the Constitution. And, there's some doomsday scenarios where we could see a state legislature potentially invoking this theory and then trying to use that as a pretext to submit their own electors. Now, whether that's legal, whether that would be successful is still an open question, but it could certainly lead to more chaos. And so the battle for these state legislatures that now have more control over access to abortion, voting, our democratic institutions is just that much more real and visceral, and national groups are really starting to recognize it. The States Project is an outside Democratic group. They're spending $60 million on 5 states. For Democracy, which is another Democratic group, is spending $20 million. So there's a lot of money coming into these, state legislative races that in the past have just been, mostly a candidate knocking on doors, handing out postcards, knowing everyone in the district and hoping they vote for him.
Nick, a quick last question. This lack of trust in the political process, lack of trust in the so-called mainstream media, has that affected you as a reporter in trying to cover this process?
I think the only thing that has kind of, changed how we go about it is just there's no longer the simple ability to call up, any politician you want and hope to get an interview or a question or have access and the ability to ask what you hope are voters' questions so that then you can report and voters can, be better informed as they go in. And there's certain candidates who have just completely written off anything but the most friendly outlets. Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, for example, he doesn't hold many public events. He doesn't always say where he's going to be. He advertises through conservative media. He does basically exclusively conservative media interviews. If we're doing a story on he's a state senator Mastriano, we can never even get a response, from an email that's supposed to be, his press secretary. And even in, some of the most combative days of the Trump White House, of the Obama White House, different governors, I've covered Christie, Murphy, you can always get a response. There's still like an understanding of the necessity of, journalism and the First Amendment. And that just kind of has seemed to switch a little bit. Now, whether that works, I think we'll find out. Mastriano has this theory of the case that he only needs his base, and that's how he can win. He doesn't need to talk to anyone but conservative outlets, and they have a big enough reach. And if he loses, maybe that'll change.
We'll see soon enough. Nick Corisaniti, thank you for joining us, national correspondent of the New York Times. Coming up next, crime in our own city. Welcome back to the New York Times Close Up. On Monday of this week, a man was pushed onto the subway tracks in Queens and died. It was the 9th homicide in the subway system this year, breaking a record that was set just last year. The previous week, the police commissioner vowed that the police force would do more. And while crime is a constant in New York and always has been, Mayor Eric Adams campaigned on a law and order promise. So what is being done? Corey Kligannon is a Metro reporter on the crime beat. He's been following all of it and joins us now. Corey, is crime in fact going up, or are people more worried about it? What's happening in the city?
Both of those things are true. Crime has gone up a little bit since the pandemic. Before the pandemic, crime was at record lows in New York. I mean, you go back to the early 90s and we had more than 2,000 murders a year, and it was below 300 murders a year in the 2019, let's say. And then in the pandemic, murders spiked a bit, and in the 2 years since then, murders have gone up incrementally. While other crime categories are actually down this year, but are actually up this year, murders and shootings are actually down this year from last year. So the whole thing is it's not the mayhem that you might see in some of the front pages of the tabloids, but crime is up in the city a bit. Perception is is everything. The perception is the whole.
Sure, it's certainly not the crime that some of us remember from the 70s and 80s when crime, you could argue, was rampant. But it is perception, as you say. So why is the perception, I think you could argue, unless, of course, you're a victim of a crime or know a victim of a crime, why does the perception seem to be so much greater than the reality, at least statistically?
I mean, part of the reason I think is that, like you said, there's been 9 killings in the subway system, and the subway is so crucial now to the rebounding of the city, to getting people back to the office, to getting the city back to pre-pandemic, thriving as it was. And people get nervous. They have to take the subway, and if they see the front page that someone just got killed on the subway, especially when they're random attacks, and it could happen to you type of mentality. I think that's one reason. Is
there any sense as to why crime is going up to whatever extent it is? You mentioned the pandemic. Why should crime go up during a pandemic? I mean, presumably there are fewer people outside, or there are more people sick. Why does that affect crime, as best we can tell?
I mean, there were guesses that partly the pandemic was basically messing with people's heads. There were a lot of people who were, cooped up indoors and, kind of going crazy with that. And there have been people speculating that policing kind of pulled back a little bit, especially the Black Lives Matter protests, a wave of kind of anti-cop wave, came over New York, and kind of a pushback against what people were calling aggressive policing, especially in Black and brown communities. And some people might say that especially with body cameras and more scrutiny on police behavior, some cops may have gotten less aggressive, stepping in and confronting certain situations, that type of thing.
Is there any evidence that so-called bail reform and lowering the numbers, although they seem to be rising again in terms of stop and frisk, had an effect on crime?
I was just reading this new piece in The Atlantic today that there was this study that's saying that some of the bail reform and some of the more progressive prosecutors, crime has not necessarily risen in those cities that have those people and those things. It's basically stayed the same, but I don't really know the numbers linked. I think that the kind of jury's out necessarily on what the link is. If, for example, Prosecutor Alvin Bragg, there's been criticism of him that he was downgrading crimes and letting people go, and I think it's hard to say whether that resulted in any kind of uptick in crime.
Why is crime in the subway, and this is sort of a rhetorical question, creates so much more of a perception of fear among people?
I just think people are closer together. Again, the subway is something that there's so much pressure on the subway to come back to its ridership, which is over 5 million people a day before the pandemic, and people use it every day to get to work. And you're in the subway car, you're stuck in there. In April there was a mass shooting in Brooklyn that it's a miracle that no one got killed. I think 10 people got shot, and the guy fired his gun about 30 times. I mean, it's a confined setting. There's kind of nowhere to run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like you're in a tin can. Right. And those doors close and you don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
You've written a lot about guns, and you wrote recently about the shooting of officers in Connecticut, which has pretty tough gun controls. How do you keep guns from coming into communities like Connecticut, like New York, depending on how we get around the Supreme Court decision, that have strict gun controls, but the guns are coming from the outside?
Right. So even if states like Connecticut, New York, New Jersey have strict gun control laws, the guns come up from the South. They call it the iron pipeline, where the states don't have as strict laws, and the guns are smuggled in. So that's been the huge challenge. Like Mayor Adams has made such a big point of we have to try to if we can tackle the gun issue, we can tackle the crime issue.
So how do we do that? You talked about zones in the city that we're trying to define as being gun-free. Does that help us get around the law? And then, like with Times Square, how do you define those? What is Times Square, for instance?
Right. They tried to create boundaries for Times Square, and they were a little bit at odds to what you and I might think of Times Square. They went way further uptown and way further west than we would.
Yeah, and why can't Times Square be the 5 boroughs?
Right. Yeah. But one other thing that Mayor was bringing back was these anti-gun squads and anti-crime type of squads that got criticized at some point for being too aggressive, especially in communities of color. And the mayor was in favor of bringing them back with some modifications. We're saying, well, we can tweak, we can train these officers to not, to be more sensitive and to not be as indiscriminately stopping, black and brown men, as what happened was happening with stop and frisk years ago.
Do we have a sense, I know you mentioned we don't have the statistics necessarily available right now, but is stop and frisk escalating again? And should it be? Did that tactic work? It was one of those things that I always found difficult to sort of disprove a negative. We were stopping and frisking a lot of people who had no guns, but were they not carrying guns because of stop and frisk?
Right. I'm not really sure of the numbers on that, but one interesting point is that the mayor, when he was a police captain, he was very opposed to stop
Right,
and frisk.
I remember
and I think
that.
he actually testified in the key trial that kind of knocked stop and frisk out during the Bloomberg years. And now he wants to bring it back, albeit a modified version of it. So people had brought that point up that now he is, the fact that Eric Adams came up through the police department. He spent 22 years as a cop and a captain, rising through the ranks, and he had a very interesting perspective on crime and on the police department. He was very critical of the police department, and he kind of made that kind of his rise into politics, was speaking out on camera when very few people did, who were in the department speaking against the department. And now that he was running for mayor, he had to kind of address what a lot of voters were wary about crime, and he had to back the police department, and be a tough on crime mayor, while being sensitive to the post George Floyd type of sentiment that we don't want to over police and be over aggressive, especially in communities of color and that type of thing.
Is there a sense, I mean, you talk to cops a lot and you talk to people on the street, is there a sense that they are satisfied with the work of this police commissioner?
I think the police commissioner is respected within the department. I think also that the mayor wants to exert a certain amount of control over the police department, possibly over the commissioner.
As any mayor usually does.
Right, yeah. And the mayor has a deputy mayor for public safety that is also pretty influential, supposedly, in the police department and what it's doing.
Is crime the major issue in the city now, do you think?
I mean, if it's not it's one of the most, because again, with the city coming back, and of course politically now it's part of the governor's race, with Congressman Zeldin from Long Island really socking it to Kathy Hochul, calling her soft on crime, and he's kind of showing up at a lot of these crimes. He'll show up and hold a press conference the next day, and he's managed to make it, really narrow the gap in that race, and really catch, start to catch her by making a crime a major platform of his. And I think also too, kind of this, Breslin had a great line in a column once back in the bad old days of crime, dies the victim, dies the city. And it was, in this case, it was in respect to a young man in Brooklyn who got kind of shot for a sheep coat. And again, another random attack, kind of like these subway, random attacks today. And Breslin was making the point, dies the victim, dies the city, is that so much rise on, the murder rate and that kind of thing. So I think crime is like, New York City's path is kind of inextricably bound to crime, and the mayor's
That's
the
true.
favorability polls and that type of thing.
And under Giuliani, one of the big reasons for the comeback of the city was the reduction of crime. And, people assume a mayor cannot do too much about inflation, but with redeploying the police department, increasing the numbers, there is a sense that crime is somehow within the purview of the police department, even though you can't stop guns coming in from elsewhere and things like that. Thanks to Corey Kligannon of the New York Times. And coming up next, I'll have some thoughts on ballot proposals on the November 8th ballot. Like a scene out of Sleeping Beauty, Bill de Blasio looked in the mirror and proclaimed, "New York is the fairest big city of them all." Leaving little to chance, though, 3 proposals on the ballot in New York City November 8th would codify municipal government's commitment to the former mayor's goal. Whatever your viewpoint, the proposals are worth parsing before you vote. One creates a "We the People" preamble to the city charter. In response to protests against systemic racism and police violence, it envisions, quote, "a just and equitable city for all." Who could disagree? What's just to you, though, may not be for me. And how do we achieve equitability? 2 ways, according to the proposal. They leave a Grand Canyon-sized gap for interpretation. One is, quote, to reconstruct, revise, and reimagine the city's foundations, structures, institutions, and laws. The other is to acknowledge and speak to historical wrongs. Another proposal would create an Office of Racial Equality and a Commission on Racial Equality. It would also require every city agency to create racial equality plans every 2 years to undo the legacy of structured racism. And the third would unofficially measure poverty by eliminating public assistance, housing subsidies, food stamps as income in calculating a true cost of living in the city. The devil, as always, will be in the details. Speaking of which, the Center for an Urban Future has just reported on 150 specific proposals to make the city more equitable. Some are cost-free and practical. Others are more visionary. Without waiting to create another commission, an office, or a mountain of biennial plans, why not cherry-pick the most commonsensical right now? For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.